Welcome to Into Theology. Today, Ian and I are going to talk about our next series into Theology, where we are going to read through large sections of the great Protestant thinker Thomas Aquinas.
Yeehaw, can't wait.
And probably we should start, and I'll ask you because I don't want to answer this question.
Uh-oh.
Why in the world would we study Thomas Aquinas? Because we're Protestants, and therefore the church didn't begin until 1517. And if I remember correctly, Thomas lives in the 1200s.
Well, it's because we're closet papists, and what we're really trying to do is make this about what is it? I guess the gospel. What would be how would we call this? The papist coalition, maybe, or something?
Correct.
The justification by infused righteousness
Oh yeah.
coalition, something like that.
Yeah, I think that you probably just completely identified the exact reason for using Aquinas.
Well, don't forget, there's maybe we could call it the Nature Grace Coalition or
The
something
Nature
like
Grace
that.
Yeah, that's actually true. That's the Grace Coalition, the Grace. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
okay, so that's one set of answers that probably some people might generate. There might be another set of answers. In fact, I'm going to take back me asking you this question. I realized that was a huge error on my part. And I'll just say a couple things, then you can kind of build on that and say what you want. Thomas Aquinas is born in the 1200s, which means he's before the Protestant Reformation by 300 years, roughly. And therefore, to say that he is not reformed is stupid.
Obvious.
It's just like, it's not even, there's no, Augustine's not reformed either, but
Right.
we all like him. So I think that's probably just a good starting point. Secondly, Thomas Aquinas is called by someone like R.C. Sproul the most intelligent Christian theologian that he knows of. I think he says Thomas Aquinas and Jonathan Edwards are maybe tied, but he tips his hat to Thomas Aquinas and used him frequently. And this is not just a out of the blue designation by one guy in Florida, Florida man, R.C. Sproul kind of thing.
He ain't in Florida anymore.
During the heyday of Reformed Orthodoxy in the 17th century at the University of Leiden, they actually used Thomas Aquinas as one of the key textbooks for ministers of the gospel. And it was because it was useful and good. I was listening to a podcast yesterday, The Mortification of Spin, where they were talking about Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God. Is that it? Yeah.
Yep.
And just the discussion was like how frequently Charnock is regularly citing even contemporary Roman Catholics, just all over the place, Dominicans, Franciscans, and not least of which then he would go back to things like Thomas as well. So there's a venerable tradition in the Reformed world to be citing these kinds of guys, the scholastics. And again, it's not really fair, in my opinion, to call Thomas Aquinas a Roman Catholic, because it's a bit controversial, but I don't really think Roman Catholicism really exists until the 1600s. I think it's a chaotic Catholicism that we pretend is unified.
Yeah.
Because we think about it after Vatican I, Vatican II, from the 20th century point of view. But if you go to like the 16th, 15th, 14th, 13th, 12th, 11th century, it is regional, chaotic, well, somewhat chaotic. It's pretty much they're Baptists.
You know? That's it. Yeah. So you are a landmark Baptist. Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Thomas Aquinas is part of the Trail of Blood. But I think if you think of this unified phalanx of the Roman Church, it just doesn't work. It's not true. Kind of rambling a bit at this point, so I'll let you say something now.
Well, I mean, there's been a kind of modern Reformed-ish antipathy towards Thomas or Thomism or whatever. That's really kind of like early mid 20th century, maybe. It's interesting, there's that chapter in the book on the reception of Thomas Aquinas that Matthew Levering co-edited, and the chapter by James Eglinton looking at Kuyper on Thomas.
Right.
I was really surprised by that chapter because I had just assumed that Kuyper was just full-on anti-Thomism. Now, he's not a Thomist, obviously. He thinks Neo-Calvinism is a better way to go. But he's got very, very high praise for Thomas Aquinas, and basically says if you don't read him, like you're not a good Christian theologian, So I had kind of always thought that maybe the culprit was Abraham Kuyper in terms of the turn away from Thomas, and I'm sure it's there a little bit. You get somebody like Herman Dooyeweerd who absolutely just botches the history of philosophy. I think he's probably the major turning point. And
unsubscribe.
Yeah.
The one Doyervirdian who's listening to us right now is already unsubscribed.
Subscribe. uh, I mean, there's so much to appreciate in Doyver. I'm not trying to totally like trash him, but I'm just saying, like,
I
he
think
just
I'm
doesn't
teaching on
understand.
him in like 3 weeks or something.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, I mean, like, there's so much that's fascinating about Doyver. I'm not trying to be entirely negative about him, but he doesn't understand the history of philosophy. There's just no doubt about it. And so then you get somebody like Van Til, Cornelius Van Til, who then kind of takes that Doyervirdian approach and then just completely just, I mean, undercuts any Thomism at all within Protestantism and just botches Protestantism as a result. And then you get, Francis Schaeffer, who popularizes that. And so you get like, there's this genealogy where here we are now having these debates about Thomas Aquinas that, like, if you talk to any reformer or post-Reformation theologian, they would be just baffled. I mean, even somebody like a Luther or a Calvin, right? Like this book here by Dennis Jans, who's also Canadian, interestingly, Luther and Late Medieval Thomism. I mean, he shows in this that, like, Luther is a scholastic, even when he's critical of Thomas, and his understanding of Thomas is a kind of a misunderstanding of him. But scholasticism is just right through the Protestant tradition. You can't know Protestantism, you can't know Lutheran or Reformed Orthodoxy if you don't just understand the basics of Thomism. So I think what we're doing here is going to be really important as part of this larger retrieval project that's been going on for a while, of just trying to recapture those key elements. That's why I like Peter Kreeft's the Summa of the Summa, his summary of the larger set, because he really focuses in on those major areas in Thomas's thought that Protestants have just always agreed with. And there are going to be variations, obviously, within Protestantism in terms of how much appreciation, but there's an appreciation there no matter what. And so we're not doing anything un-Protestant by engaging with Thomas's thought. If anything, we're leaning into our Protestant past by really trying to understand and explicate Thomas's thought.
Yeah, I don't know any early Orthodox Reform person who doesn't engage with Thomas. Like, I can't.
Yeah.
Maybe it's sometimes more generalized than specific, but someone like Franciscus Junius, for example, would be deeply into it. The Leiden,
Zanke or Sinus, you just
like
go
everyone
right down the line.
It's not like it's an exceptional thing. It's like it's the norm.
Yeah,
There's always critical appreciation as well as appreciation, but that's normal. Like, you should expect that. And one of the easiest ways to illustrate this is everyone today still talks about the material and formal cause of the Reformation, right? And you're like, okay, that's just scholasticism.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
yeah, form and matter right there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aristotle.
Yeah, thank you, Aristotle. So it's so built in. I think if you're listening to this, what we're saying probably sounds abstract, but I think in the first few episodes you'll realize this is exactly how every Reformed person sounds when the world is going on. And the answer is that scholasticism is not a set of theological principles, but merely a culture of theology that tried to answer questions in a specific format. And maybe you would say the format's a bit not your favorite. That's fine, but you can't dismiss a movement because of its format, basically.
Right.
The idea of how it wants to learn, how it wants to ask questions. Basically, the scholastic format is almost like a catechism. Like, it's a question and answer.
And just like I tell my students this all the time when they ask questions and they're like sort of confusing things. I'll say, listen, all theology is about making good distinctions. And so scholasticism is so remarkably helpful. The fact that we lost scholasticism has been a real negative for theology, because to be able to make like very fine distinctions really helps you with your theological understanding, as you're like categorizing. That's what the mind does, right? The intellect categorizes things to just help it understand. And so it's like, it's just basic to human knowing to do this. And if we can't make those right distinctions, we're just walking around in a sea of confusion.
Yeah, maybe another way to put this is that reading Thomas makes you less stupid.
Yeah, right.
Well,
I tend to feel more stupid when I read him, because he was so just unbelievably brilliant that you're just like, wow.
Mm-hmm. He was. And I think people are going to enjoy. Probably, I'm going to guess most people listening will have not read him before.
Yeah.
So there'll be an article that I think next week from when we're recording this, which will have links to like free online Thomas Aquinas stuff for the reading. But you can also buy the Peter Crift book that we'll link as well.
Yeah, so it's Ignatius Press. I actually use this as a textbook in my historical theology. What I really like about it is he doesn't, we can maybe talk about next time we record, just like how this is organized,
Right.
how to read like the questions and the objections, the reply to objections, and then Thomas's own views. But he doesn't he focuses on key things and doesn't get bogged down in some of the minutia that Thomas can. He's got really helpful, like a helpful apparatus at the bottom to
Right.
explain things. He's got a good glossary. So it's just very clear and understandable. So like as an intro for somebody who's coming at Thomas cold and has never read anything of significance by him, it's a great way, and my students benefit from it. It's interesting. It doesn't get into some of the more specifically like Roman Catholic teachings, like transubstantiation. So maybe at one point we could do like an episode just dealing with that question. But it's all these things that I honestly think like every pastor, every aspiring theologian should at least have this, if not the full Summa on shelf. If you don't get it in time for follow along with us, go to the Aquinas.cc website, and it has all his writings, both in Latin and English. Really helpful, easy to navigate, and you can follow along there too.
And I think I'm going to create kind of a reading plan, but the reading should be short enough where it's only like a few pages, I think, for each episode. I have to double check.
It's just
not that
fun
long
stuff, man. Like it's like, what is the nature of theology? Is theology a science? Is it what it starts out with? Your proofs for the existence of God, and then like going right into all these like attributes. And we're just going to spend
is scripture?
So much time.
Who is God? What is he like? Like it's all good stuff. It's going to generate thoughts that will make you
the
think
virtues,
more about God.
like getting into all the
That's
virtues,
what I'm most looking forward to.
It's going to be fun.
The theological anthropology and virtues is what I'm most looking forward to.
I also would like, based on what we were just saying about like the Reformed tradition being so deeply engaged with Thomistic thought and other areas of scholasticism too. Like we don't want to just say everything's Thomism. Obviously Scotus is back there, Suarez and some others, but
Scotus.
Scotus,
the Supreme
Scotus.
Court.
Well, there's that too, yeah. But Aquinas among the Protestants by Van Drunen and Svensson. This is super helpful, man. Good. Like some of the chapters in here. Speaking of Doyeweerd, it's hilarious. There's actually a chapter in here by a Doyeweerd expert, Jonathan Chaplin, who looks at some of this, as well as John Bolt's chapter. Had been out of that Kuyperian tradition, and he details his kind of a discovery of Thomas. You have Stefan Lindholm's Zanke's use of Aquinas. David Seitzma looking at Aquinas' biblical interpretation, looking at the English.
He's read one or two of those authors before, I would guess.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Seitzma. We should get Seitzma on here. I think he.
Yeah, I've asked him to podcast before. I think he was like busy at the time, but he was like open to it. I think generally.
Yeah, he's in Tokyo too. So Jordan Baller on Thomas and the rise of Protestant scholasticism. I mean, every chapter in this book is so helpful, and you cannot come away from this thinking that that what we would be doing in this is a bastardization of Protestantism. It's like, no, we're leaning into our tradition by doing this.
Yeah, it's so funny how history works. In the minds of some, it's the opposite. But I mean, the more reformed you are, the more, in the right sense, inclusive you are of all the things that you can read and appreciate.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you agree with everything, by the way.
Sure.
But it means
it's a critical appropriation.
It's wild how even the 17th century, how Protestants and Roman Catholics still had some sort of cordial relationship and were able to, in certain cases, walk together, talk, because they had uncles and cousins who were like on either side of the fence in this thing. And then eventually that seems to break down until we get to today where we don't really talk to each other anymore. And that's that's historically weird.
It'd be fun. We should try to get somebody.
We'll get like Thomas.
I'd love to get Matthew Minard.
I was going to say Joseph. Is it Joseph White? Who's the guy that just published the
Trinity Thomas book? Joseph White.
Yeah.
He'd be awesome. I think he'd be hard to get. I mean, he's like the Dominican of Dominicans today. But the one guy I'm fascinated, I'd love to interview because that's been doing a lot of translation of a later neo-Thomist, Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. would be to get Matthew Minard on.
I was
I
gonna say,
think
I don't think Lagrange is alive anymore, man.
no,
Like,
he died in like
it's like,
1960.
I mean,
But no, to get his the guy that's doing a lot
yeah,
of translation of his work would
right,
be
Minard.
Matthew Minard. He'd
Yep.
be a lot of. I've listened to so many of his podcasts, and he'd just be. I bet you he'd be fun to talk to.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. I think this is a good introduction. So, long story short, we'll start next week. We should have an article out with a reading plan and some links to the books and writings we talked about, and we'll, I guess, jump into the Summa, book 1,
Ooh,
part 1, whatever, next
whatever.
week.
Let's do it, man. What is sacred doctrine, right?